bells ringing, bells ringing, bells ringing. Hear the 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 bells ringing, they're singing that you can be born again. Hear the bells ringing, they're singing Christ is risen from the dead. The angels of the said he has risen just
One of my favorite accounts in the Gospels is the story of Jesus and Peter on the water. If our kids haven't already gone to Discoveryland, they are dismissed to go to their time as well. Matthew chapter 14 is a story of Jesus and Peter on the water. Most of you are familiar with it, I'm sure. It was the fourth watch in the night, between 3 and 6 in the morning, and Jesus had sent the disciples to go on to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, a bit of context, the Sea of Galilee, this sea extends 21 kilometers in one direction and 13 kilometers in another. So it's about 166 square kilometers. It's a significant body of water. The account goes, it's stormy, and Jesus comes walking on the water, and the disciples are afraid, thinking it's a ghost. Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come." And Peter gets out of the boat, and he walks on the stormy water towards Jesus. Yes, I know it's Easter. I haven't forgotten. Be patient. We'll get there. Thinking about this story of Jesus on the water and the disciples in the boat, I was thinking it from the perspective of the rest of the disciples. The rest of the disciples, they're in this boat that's made of wood, and it's not overly large. The boat that they crossed in was maybe 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and four and a bit feet deep. It would carry about 15 people. Now, I want you to imagine in this storm, these men clinging to the boat like their life depended on it. And from close up, from where they were close up, clinging to the side, that's probably the way it was. The boat seemed worth holding on to. It was probably, for these disciples, the most important thing in their life at that moment. To fall out of the boat in the storm, well, that would be it. I want you to back up a little bit. We look at some of these stories, and Jesus is on the water, and the disciples are clinging to this boat in this storm, and we narrow in, and we're right there in the moment. But I want you to back up a little bit and take an aerial view, and as you get bigger and bigger in your Google Zoom and get the aerial view, the boat doesn't look that big in the midst of a sea that is 21 by 13 kilometers. This 27-foot boat, this tiny boat in the midst of the large stormy sea. See, when Peter was going over the edge towards Jesus, that probably seemed like a pretty crazy thing for him to do. But answer me this question. What makes you think that staying in the boat was really all that safe anyways? When you back up, when you see this small wooden boat on this Sea of Galilee in the midst of this storm, what makes you think that clinging to the sides of the boat was really that safe anyways? Remember a few years back there was an article about a freak accident that happened in Cabo San Lucas. And it was a small whale-watching boat. It was returning from its time. It's heading back into shore. And while it was heading into shore, this great humpback whale emerged right in front of this large boat. And the boat hit the whale, and the accident left one fatality that was thrown from the boat. I mean, a freak accident. This large ocean. And what seemed like a large boat. Who would have thought? No one would have expected. The boat should be perfectly safe, right? Said that on the Titanic, too. In perspective, I remember thinking a little bit of that. I had the privilege in 2009 to go kayaking off of the west coast of Vancouver Island, off Eucalypt, and this small kayak on this big ocean. It was a blast. It was one of my highlights of that trip. And remember thinking that this is a big ocean and wondering all of what was underneath. And didn't see any whale then. We did see one later. Part of the trade-off with Carla was I got to go ahead and do that, but I took her. I had to. No, I didn't. I wanted to. We went on a yacht later that night and had supper and did whale watching on this much, much bigger boat. And we saw the whales off the side, but the whales were still bigger than the boat. The point I want to instill in your mind, the image that I want to instill in your mind at this point is a group of Christ followers clinging for their lives in a smallish, fragile boat on the stormy sea while Jesus is somewhere else. While Jesus is somewhere else. And I want you to understand that for them, for these disciples, who probably thought that Peter was the crazy one, this smallish wooden boat was the container of their faith. This small woodish boat was the container of their faith. It was the boundaries, the limits of which they saw their faith. As long as we are in the boat, we're safe in the boat. Now, we all have them. We all have containers for our faith. We all have boundaries which hold our faith. How far our faith will stretch. Our sense of what we need in order to be safe in this life. Our perceptions of what is possible. How far it's okay to stray from the boat until it gets uncomfortable for us. Our boat that carries our faith, for some of us, it is our finances. Our boat that carries our faith, that sets the boundaries of our faith, many times is defined by our bank accounts, by our material resources, by our jobs. That is what keeps us safe. That is the boundaries of what we see to be activity that we will go from one end of the boat to the other, but not over the side. We won't leave the boat. Sometimes the boundaries are our perceived talents and abilities. That is the limits of our faith. Our perceived talents and abilities. You remember Moses, when God called Moses and God said to Moses that he was going to use him to set his people free. And Moses' response was, I'm not the one. I can't speak. I can't speak in front of people. Don't put me in front of a group of people because I'm going to stutter and I can't do it. And for Moses, the boundaries of his faith were his perceived abilities. What he could see himself doing or not doing. And God called him past the boundaries of his faith into something that for Moses would have seemed very insecure. For some people, the boat, the container of our faith, is our past experiences. Our past experiences. If I've seen it done this way before, then that's the way I'm going to do it again. And for those of us of whom the boundaries of our faith are our past experiences, our mantra, the words that we say most often in life is, wait a minute, it has never been done that way before. And if it's never been done that way before, I'm not going to risk doing it differently now. For some, it's people. The boundaries of our faith are people, or even the approval of significant people in my life. Lord, if people in my life, I will function within the boundaries of the approval of people in my life. But God, if that approval isn't there, or if you take those people out of my life, or my community context changes, I can't see any possibilities for God's activity outside of that. I need to stay in the safety of my boat. Lord, I'll follow you anywhere you say as long as I can stay in my boat. But dear people, whoever said that staying in the boat was all that safe? Peter stepped out of that container. Peter stepped out of that boat, and he became part of an incredible story that had him walking with Jesus on water in the midst of a storm. Let me ask you this morning, what is the container that holds your faith? What is the container that you will trust God within? This is where you will do or not do. Just, Lord, don't ask me. Don't call me to go over the sides. I need to stay within this. What container holds your belief in the possibilities of what God might do within your life this morning? Now, I get it. I'm a calculating kind of person. That's my personality. I get it. And Jesus talked about counting the cost and giving thought about whether we're going to be able to follow through on stuff that we engage with. And there's nothing wrong with that. But upon what are those calculations based? The dimensions of the boat or the presence and power of God? It was early in the morning, dawn on the first day of the week, our Sunday. A number of ladies, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they were bringing spices to anoint the body of the Lord Jesus. This was a custom. They couldn't do so on the Sabbath, so they'd waited till the next day. These women had watched the death of Jesus. They were present at the crucifixion. It is finished, Jesus said. And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. They were there when Joseph of Arimathea took the body and wrapped it in clean linen cloth and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. The body of Jesus, bloodied, beaten, a spear had been thrust into his side. Jesus had been whipped. A crown of thorns had been beaten down upon his head. The very thorns that were representative of the curse of the ground from Adam and Eve. The ground will be cursed with thorns. We fashion them together into a crown that we will put upon our Savior's head. The Roman centurion had verified Jesus was dead. Jesus was dead. Now, some say that the resurrection was a hoax. Some say Jesus didn't actually die, that he survived and was revived later. Others try to say that the disciples had stole Jesus' body. It was all a hoax. And still others think that the women went to the wrong tomb. While the Roman soldiers were experienced with death, they knew when someone was dead. And when they were able to verify that Jesus was dead, we can have confidence that they knew what they were talking about. And really, the likelihood of Jesus surviving the kind of beating that he took, the crucifixion experience that he had, for him surviving all of that, being placed within a tomb, having it sealed with a rock, having soldiers guarding it on the outside, for Jesus to have revived, got out of the tomb that was sealed, snuck past the guards, make it to where the disciples were, and be in such a glorious appearance that he convinced them that this was some glorious miracle. I mean, that's the stuff that movies are made of. That's not real life. The centurion said that Jesus was dead. We can have confidence in that. Some believe it was the wrong tomb that the women showed up at. Well, the Pharisees knew that there was this rumor about a resurrection that would take place. And if they had gone to the wrong tomb, the Pharisees would have simply produced the body of Jesus from the right tomb. And this whole resurrection thing would have been over with. But that didn't take place. There are those that say the disciples stole the body. Well, the Pharisees, concerned about this rumor, had Roman guards stationed at the tomb. They even bribed them afterwards to say, just say you had fallen asleep. The thing is, these professional soldiers, had they been derelict in their duty, risked their life and would have been put to death themselves. They were not falling asleep at the tomb. These trained Roman guards, if they failed, they would not have left the body be stolen. And even if for some reason you think that might have happened, 10 out of the 11 disciples that were remaining died violent deaths for their proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the 11th one was suffered in prison. And the likelihood that 11 people would hold that kind of conspiracy together in the face of that kind of persecution, not likely. Not likely. The historical and eyewitness evidence supports the claim that the resurrection is true. On the way to the tomb, the women asked the question. We read this in the Gospel of Mark. Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? This was the question that was asked. Who will roll the stone away? They expected to find Jesus' dead body. They expected to find Jesus' dead body. The perception of the possibilities of what might happen that day for them did not go beyond a sealed tomb. You see, for these women, even as the disciples in the boat on the sea, the boat was the container of their faith. At this moment, a sealed tomb was the container of these women's faith. The sealed tomb was the boundary of their expectations, of their perception of the possibility. Their faith did not yet extend beyond the container of the tomb. We read again the passage in Matthew chapter 28, verse 5. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come and see the place where they lay him. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." You know, at first the disciples didn't believe Mary and Salome when they showed up. First, the disciples didn't believe. They thought this was ridiculous. Peter and John got up and they ran to the tomb. John paused at the entrance. Peter barreled right in. And the tomb was empty. Over the next while, Jesus would appear. Jesus would appear to Peter. Specifically, he would appear to these women. He would appear to the rest of the disciples on a number of occasions. On one occasion, he was seen by over 500 people at once. The resurrected Jesus taught the disciples, the followers, over the next period of 40 days until he ascended into heaven and sent the Holy Spirit to bring about the birth of the church at Pentecost. Now, here's where I'm going with this morning. The images and the containers that defined our faith. The images that hold our faith and give us the perception of what is possible. Our faith in what is possible with our God. See, I see a group of disciples in a fragile boat clinging to it for survival on a stormy sea, while outside of the container of their faith is Jesus and Peter walking on the water. I see a tomb that is sealed with a large stone, with the expectation that nothing escapes death. It's a sealed tomb. It's a container, the initial limits of these women and early disciples' faith. And then I see a tomb with a stone that has been miraculously rolled away. A God that is not limited even by the experience of death. Let me ask you this morning, What are the possibilities that faith in the resurrection brings? What happens to the limits of our faith in what God may do in our midst, in our lives, once the stone is rolled away? Started rereading a book this last week, and it's one of those books I pick up just because of the title. The book is called The Christian Atheist. Now, that's an oxymoron if ever you've heard one. Two words that contradict one another, Christian atheist. But in reality, that's sometimes our experience as Christians. The subtitle of the book, Christian Atheist, believing in God but living as though he didn't exist. Believing in God and living as though he didn't exist. And he writes in the book, Welcome to Christian Atheism, where people believe in God but live as though he doesn't exist. And then he goes on, some of his chapters are, when you believe in God but you don't really know him, or you aren't sure he loves you, or you believe in God but not in prayer. You believe in God but don't think anything can change. You believe in God but trust more in your money. You believe in God but still worry all the time. Believing in God, but not believing in possibilities. Believing in the resurrection, but does that make any difference to our faith? What does it mean for you and I to believe that Jesus Christ is God the Son and that he died, but he rose again from the dead? Does that hold any meaning for us beyond just a belief in a historical experience? Are the boundaries of your faith this morning, are the boundaries of your faith merely the edges of a fragile boat on the rough seas while Jesus is doing something elsewhere, outside of the boat? Have you set the boundaries? Have we set our boundaries of faith by a sealed tomb or by the possibilities that are present once the stone is rolled away? He is risen, we declare. And you said, he is risen indeed. Which of these images this morning most defines your faith? The edges of the boat, the sealed tomb, or a tomb in which the stone has been rolled away? You know what the first words were after the resurrection? The first encounter with the angels, with Jesus himself after the resurrection, the first words were this: do not be afraid. The first words after the resurrection, do not be afraid. You see, I think the empty tomb strips away the limitations of what we may place on God, of the possibilities that we might place upon our lives. But sometimes I think we are afraid. We are afraid to take a chance on life outside of our sealed containers. Afraid to take a chance on trusting God away from our money, outside of our addictions, outside of our usual support networks, outside of our experiences, our gifts, and our talents. We are afraid to let God expand our faith outside of the fragile boats that we too often cling to. But dear people, whoever said that staying in the boat would be safe? But you remember this. Jesus doesn't calm the storm for Peter before he gets out of the boat. That's an important observation to get for us. Jesus does not calm the storm for Peter before he gets out of the boat. There's lots of scary stuff out there. When he says, come follow me in the place that I am, it might be stormy. The empty tomb, the stone rolled away, only has meaning because of the death and suffering that preceded it. And so our experience in seeing our faith expand, the possibilities of what God may do in our lives and through our lives may also include, in fact, must also include stormy waters and experiences where stuff dies. Don't expect to be spared the trials. Just know that the power of God will prevail. And in some cases, in some of your stories, that power might be seen in all its glory after you take your last breath. But it doesn't mean that Jesus isn't still present along the way. Which is safer? To walk hand in hand with Jesus on a stormy sea, or to cling to the perceived safety of a flimsy boat that he's not in? Sometimes it seems so big, but when you step back into an aerial view of it all, you realize that it is still the thing you put your faith in, the thing that's limited your faith outside of God, is still pretty small. You and I will live under one of two kinds of images. Either that, of clinging to the fragile boat on a stormy sea, or we will live under the image of an empty tomb, of a living God, and of resurrection possibilities. I want to ask you this morning, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ? I would expect that, being that you're here and it's Easter Sunday, probably for most of you that would be true. So then let me ask you this. How does that belief affect the boundaries of your faith? What is possible with and through your life? Peter, walking on water, was not foolhardy faith. He said, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come. We discern, we listen for the voice of God. But I think that sometimes, many times, Jesus would call us away from false securities and into faith adventures more than what we seem to hear. Just remember, God's will, living by faith, does include stormy waters. Matthew 28, verse 8. Last verse this morning. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy. Let that image sink in. They went to the tomb expecting this limitation. They walked away experiencing the resurrection of Christ. They left the tomb to go tell the disciples. They hurried. They were afraid, yes, but they were filled with joy. Something is different now because Jesus is alive. Yes, they might be a bit anxious about the unpredictable possibilities that the resurrection brings. And if you take this to heart this morning, if the resurrection of Christ expands your faith outside of the present container that you have been holding it in, then it may be that there was some anxiety. Faith isn't the absence of fear. Faith is what you will do in spite of your fear, because you believe that the presence of power of God is greater than whatever it is that you are anxious about. Something is different now because Jesus is alive. There are unpredictable possibilities that the resurrection brings. Something new, something exciting, a new hope. The hope for change, for forgiveness, for healing, for courage, for restored marriages and renewed families, for the possibility of joy to rise out of tragedy, for saying yes to a risky calling, for binding addictions, for taking a chance, because out there, outside of your present limitations to your faith, outside of the boat that you have been holding your faith in, Jesus is calling. Jesus is calling. Out there is a realm of new possibilities Because where he is outside of the boat, where he is outside of the tomb, that is where faith sees the power of God. The sides of the boat or on the water with Jesus. The sealed tomb or the empty tomb with the stone that's been rolled away. Dear people, which image will either confine or define your faith and following of God this morning? If you truly believe in the resurrection of Christ, what might that begin to look like for you? Jesus is alive. So in believing in that, what might be for you some of the resurrection possibilities?
His heart was broken, mine was mended.